This is Dialogue Conspiracy. Political research specialist Mae Brussel, whose conspiracy newsletter appears in the Realist magazine, has for 3 years shared with our listeners the fruits of her decades' research into political assassinations and the abuses of power in America. Her weekly commentary relates the news of the week to the evidence emerging about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains its power by force over America's electoral and executive processes. And now, here's Mae.
Good afternoon, Dialogue Conspiracy. This is June the 3rd, 1974. I forget which number, we've lost count. It's been 3 years now, this June. We'll give a brief few-minute summary of the Patricia Hearst case up to date, but we're going on to some other matters that are equally as important. We've been doing this for about 20 weeks now, the SLA, and a lot of you know the material we've been covering, and I'm writing about the current time. I just want to go into the last thoughts about it in the last week because to summarize what's been happening. Patricia Hearst was last seen early Saturday morning on May the 18th in the early morning hours with Emily and Bill Harris. They're two narcotic informers from Indiana, college graduates, spoken of in the press as actually her peers, graduate teachers, so she is in safe hands, in quote, safe. They were seen last kidnapping a gentleman and going for a ride for a few brief moments, at the most 2 hours, some say 20 minutes, in a Lincoln Continental, and they took $250 from him, and he left them off on foot, and that is the last, that motley crowd, Mr. and Mrs. Harris and Patricia, without a vehicle, were left off in Griffith Park on Saturday, May 18th. On Sunday night, you can have a choice. There's two Patricias, like there were two Donald DeFreeze. You can have a choice. Sunday evening, she was seen with two black men and went to a woman who she allegedly assaulted or threatened with, "Do you want to die?" And one of the gentlemen cut the woman's dress. The police aren't looking for these two men, but Patricia was charged with a crime that would give her life in prison for this little scene. So you have your sightings of Patricia Hearst. They're like the UFOs now. Some people were picked up in Hawaii. You can see her with two black men or two white, male and female, and it's become a big industry. The law enforcement have spent $5 million so far on this particular escapade. Romero and Little are sitting in jail, allegedly the ones who killed Dr. Marcus Foster. So for an investment of $10,000 robbery at a bank in San Francisco, there's a $5 million industry of police and sightings, law enforcement on the move. And there are a lot of Vietnam veterans who came home that need jobs in law enforcement. A lot of police people on the lookout. It's a business in itself. The Patricia Hearst sightings or SLA sightings will become a major industry. 10 of the SLA plus Patty are supposed to be the existing party. 6 were burned alive, 2 are in prison, and 2 are on the loose with Patricia Hearst, and that consists, if the media would tell you the truth, the SLA. There's a cast of about 25 that I'm writing up now. Agents of the CIA, the Los Angeles Police Department, the San Francisco and Oakland Police Department, and the Direct Department of Corrections that provided the safe house, the weapons, the entire teamwork that made this little escapade possible that's grown into the $5 million industry. The first report after the shooting, if you remember, was that they were all shot at a long distance. That was the first account of the coroner, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, in Los Angeles. He came out with another report 1 or 2 days later that Donald DeFreeze shot himself in the head. Camila Hall was shot between the eyes at close range, and Nancy Ling Perry was shot in the back and it severed her spinal cord. All of these were close shots, too close for a long-distance police team to shoot through a plaster wall that they died immediately. And on last week's show, if you heard it, I suggested that evidence would come later that these people were murdered at close range, and the building was set on fire to hide the tracks behind them. Nancy Ling Perry's body this last week was cremated. The ashes are scattered in the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. Dr. Wolf, Willie Wolf's father, came to Los Angeles and didn't know for several days that his son's body had been cremated on permission of his mother. They're divorced. His mother lives back east, and the police department hurried and cremated his body. And last night, the Reuters news service carried a story which was not in the Associated Press or United Press, that Singu's body went back to Cleveland and the head and the fingers were removed from the body. His brother believed that they had not actually put the body in there of Donald DeFreeze. We have the same escapade that we had with Lee Harvey Oswald's body. We have two Donald DeFreeze like we had two Lee Harvey Oswalds. So the question is, what is the Los Angeles Police Department doing with the head and fingers of Donald DeFreeze? We have to see. Dr. Wolf flew out from Pennsylvania. I had called him last Thursday, a week ago Thursday. He hadn't heard of the Louis Tackwood book, the Glass House tapes, or Don Freed's research, or the collusion of the law enforcement in the state of California in this particular case. He flew out to California. He had several press conferences with Dr. Thomas Noguchi. The first report was that there would not be a coroner's inquest. But in lieu of a lot of evidence coming in, I'm sure that there will be demanded an inquest into what happened in the house in Los Angeles. A witness did admit seeing a firebomb thrown by the police on the front door of the house. The fire department was not allowed into the area to put out the fire. The pecking order in a situation like this is the fire comes first, the policeman second. The police teams guarded off the street and would not let the fire department enter until the building was burned down. The house was set up for a rest. The woman, a Mrs. Johnson, who rented there, was in San Francisco and met the people ahead of time and arranged for them to come to this house. And she knew of an area that was cut out in the bottom of the floor where they brought in large boxes the day before, Thursday afternoon, which would be terribly suspicious. And the cover story in the media was that they found an axe and cut a hole to get underneath the floor. And you know that in a time of panic like that, it'd be just too convenient to be arranging this. Well, it turns out this house was set up and Ms. Johnson had been in San Francisco. So the Los Angeles Police Department is involved. The story will unravel, but I'm not going to do too much about it now. The police department, the SWAT team, found themselves responsible for the arrest. They became the judge and jury, and they became the executioner. We'll do more next week. But while we're talking about the SLA, some very important matters are slipping by, because the SLA is only a tip of the iceberg in the national picture, and we have to take time out like we used to do format on the shows before the SLA surfaced and go into some serious matters. The Washington Post, May 26, 1974, has a large article. It's 3/4 of the page of the newspaper, so you know that's a long article. It's not a little column. And it's written by a man called Amitai Etzonio, Amitai Etzioni. And he comes from Columbia University and is director for the Center for Policy Research, which a little investigative work would be translated into LEAA or CIA. Now, what was Mr. Edzioni writing about that got 3/4 of a page in the Washington Post on a Sunday? His article is titled, "Science is Threatening the Jury Trial." And he cites the examples of the selection of the jury in recent cases that were political cases, and the fact that the defense attorneys are using social workers or psychiatrists or to figure out the mind of the jury while they make their selections. In other words, you have several peremptory challenges you can throw out. So he says this is science threatening the jury trial. And he cites the case of the Harrisburg 7, Camden 28, the Gainesville 8, the Attica trial coming up, and the American Indian trial in St. Paul. And what he says is the trouble is that the technique of choosing the jury now raises serious doubts about the jury system, because he says the defense is using the advantages of sociologists and psychologists to help with jury selection. Well, until now, all the landed gentry of this country selected the landowners as the jurors, so it obviously was not a cross jury of peers at any time. But now that the tables are turned, the Harrisburg case, the Camden, Gainesville, Attica, American Indian, he says the defense has an advantage, and the prosecution, he claims, is getting fed up with losing the cases. I'm quoting, recent spate of acquittals demonstrates the impact of psyching out potential jurors can have on the decision. Now, what he's really saying that in a racist America where the cards are always stacked, and for the first time you have minority lawyers stepping into the cases, or you have lawyers interested in minority cases, or the anti-war case, men like Mr. Kunstler, where you have lawyers coming in and defending Charles Gary, the oppressed, then the table is turned and these people can't stand losing some of these trials. The government trials were rigged to begin with. Agent provocateurs were brought in every one of these cases. The victims were always the poor, people protesting the war. And now he claims that this kind of defense of psyching out a jury is tampering the jury trial. Now he argues that the jury selection becomes too costly. Always the public relations pitch is, we'll save you money by not selecting the jury in this fashion. He says there's too many peremptory challenges and suggests the possibility that maybe the judge alone should select the jury. Now, that was tried out in California, the home of mass murders and mass conspiracies, in the case of Edmund Kemper. I don't remember the Herbert Mullen case. I think the jury selection there was very secretive and quick also, but I know the mass murder, Edmund Kemper, the mental patient who was manipulated by the law enforcement and the authorities here, did not get a jury selected at large. It was the judge was taken in a separate chamber. So in California, we experimented with the judge selecting the jury. They don't tell you, see, in the defense of the case that one of the police chiefs in Santa Cruz was trying to fix Kemper up with his niece at all this time while these mass, in the middle of his stream of mass murders or anything like that. But the suggestion is that the judge here should select the jury, which is very dangerous, as seen and tested in Santa Cruz, California. Now, the argument is that the jury is considered a major cause of rising costs, and it delays the courtroom. It slows the process of court. Now, he closes the article with this sentence: the district attorneys, or the U.S. attorneys, cannot be expected to stand by and do nothing while the defendants in the most serious cases buy themselves a significant edge in trial after trial. The champions of the technique will have to realize that the days when it could be reserved for their favorite defendants will soon be over. Now, where Mr. Etzioni gets the authority to say that these days are over and the DA and the U.S. Attorney will prosecute as they want is a very interesting question that involves investigation of the Center for Policy Research at Columbia. Because in September 1970, in the New York Times, for those of you that do research or look this up, September 13th, 1970, in the Los Angeles Times, or September the 8th, 1970, in the New York Times, I've referred to the articles on the writing of the new Constitution, and this Constitution was set up to go into effect in 1972 after the mandate of Nixon and this administration. And because we have had a slowdown in Washington of this police state, temporarily slowed down with the Watergate investigations, all these sneaky little things around the Constitution are getting passed or pushed in the public's eye one by one. Now, 1970, what the plan was of trial by jury, one of the Constitution provisions was where we currently have 50 states. The country would be broken into 20 republics, and I have dates from Time magazine recently of the republics. The nation has been divided already into 20 large geographical areas to do away with a lot of the smaller states. And one of the things that the new Constitution would do would take no Bill of Rights any longer, no trial by jury, no right to bear arms, and no guarantee of a right to privacy. Well, we know what that is through the Watergate exposures. But one of the experts, there are 150 experts that helped to write the new Constitution, and one of those experts included Warren Burger. He wasn't appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court yet, but he went to Santa Barbara, the center where this Constitution was written up. And it was Warren Burger alone whose name is attached to the fact that he was the one that persuaded the men writing the Constitution to omit from the proposed Constitution the guarantee of trial by jury and of an adversary trial. Now, this is important because it looks like Nixon's on the way out, and we'll have Gerald Ford for president. And Warren Burger and Gerald Ford were very close in Michigan. And don't forget it for a moment. The selection of Gerald Ford to succeed Richard Nixon means he works very well with the old team. So the Justice of the Supreme Court wanted in 1970 to omit trial by jury and adversary trials, and his argument was that the jury trial slows the wheels of justice and that the adversary system does the same. And he says there's no guarantee that a formal case with two opponents does not necessarily produce justice. So that the Supreme Court defines, like they define what's national security, they define what is justice, and trial by jury does not necessarily mean we have justice. So 1970 it was planned to do away with the jury. And this morning in the paper, this is June the 3rd, 1974, following on the heels of the Washington Post article, just May 26, is an article, Jury Picking System Wastes $50 Million. A survey shows, again, a CIA front tested in Texas, Michigan, Maryland. The Byrd Engineering Research Associates of Vienna, Maryland, no, this is Virginia, Vienna, Virginia, received a $157,000 grant from the LEAA, which is the CIA branch, the Armed Forces branch of the Justice Department, and came up with the conclusion that courts waste $50 million in the methods with which they select juries. Now, in lieu of the fact that today's paper also talks about a cost overrun of $26 billion in arms, $26 billion over what, not the budget of what they had for arms last year, but over this year, it seems to me that if the jury system ran over $50 million to get a fair trial, the citizen should have the same rights as Mr. Roy Ash, who's making submarines and ships for the Navy with his cost overruns. There's a list here of $1.43 billion for the F-15s. If the cost of living has gone up that much, or $417 million for the SAM-D missile, or $349.9 million for the U-2 TAS helicopter, and $394 million for the XM tank. These are overruns. $189 million and $916 million for parts of an airborne warning system. If the overrun, not the original cost, is running to $26 billion, that doesn't matter. But if the jury takes $50 million to assure that certain people who are framed by provocateurs don't go to prison, they call that an extravagance. They don't equal what it would cost to keep all these people in jail for the rest of their lives or appeals. And also in today's paper, there's a dispute because the military wants $5.8 million for a new deadly gas when they already have enough to kill everyone on this earth. So it can't be the budget saving they want. And because in 1970 they wanted to do away with the trial by jury, and now the spoil sports are crying because people are getting out that the Justice Department wanted prosecuted, they find it necessary to say very openly the time will come where you can't choose the jury system that way. The excuse not being that we're racist or anything like that. The excuse will be we have to cut down the domestic budget. Now, I'm going into a subject today. We've heard so much of the SLA, but an item came up in the news this week that has been buried since March. I covered it on our program here in March when I picked it up in the Washington Post, and now it's again in the wire services in a bigger story by Doug Porter, Intelligence Report. And it's about the murder of Beverly Kay, the secretary at the White House. And they're talking about the SLA, and they're doing psychological profiles, and the Washington Post had a full page on what was on the mind of these radicals, keeping in mind, again, they only robbed $10,000 from a bank. So I'm going into the murders in the White House while we've been watching the Watergate take place to see who really is the violent person and what's going on in this country. James McCord, when he spoke to Judge Sirica, made the statement he didn't want to go to jail and he wanted to stall as long as possible because he said, in quotes, I worked in law enforcement for a large number of years, and I know what can happen in terms of retaliation, whether we're speaking of physical retribution or retribution of a wide variety of forms. He told his friends and family and the Watergate Committee, I have my will made out, because he said he could be stabbed or killed in prison because he knows too much, and people that know too much that topple the system are murdered. And that's why the people were burned in L.A., because they knew too much. So I brought a list of 20 people that have been murdered. Some we've talked about on different radio shows here, one each week as they came along. But in total, I thought I would read them and as time allowed, go over a few of these, because the one that came in the news this week is Beverly Kay, who works for Stephen Bull in the White House and typed up and was responsible for the White House tapes. There's Beverly Kay, who was responsible for Richard Nixon's White House tapes employed by Bull, and we'll go into the details. And there's George Bell, who made up the enemies list that Charles Colson said he didn't have. It was in the hands of George Bell. Lou Russell is dead. He is the man with information that James McCord had previous relationships with Bernard Fensterwald, who heads the committee to investigate assassinations. Congressman Mills was murdered, and this has to do with the Wallace and Maryland funding, and Arthur Brammer was arrested in Maryland, if you remember that. Colonel James Wester and James Glover are two men that worked in the Wallace operation and fundraising and responsible for the $25,000 of cash that siphoned through Congressman Mills' account. Jack Cleveland, important witness, murdered in Canada, the connecting link between Donald Nixon and a payoff from Howard Hughes. Nikos Fardionians, overseas donations, Greek money. The Watergate was going into the illegal Greek donations, and Mr. Fardionians was murdered, and that protects Mr. Tom Pappas, I'm sure, who gave much more than Nikos, but I'm sure they get the message. If one is killed, the others become silent. Like in Mrs. Dorothy Hunt, when she was killed, her plane crashed with the payoff money, the blackmail, Richard Nixon, then Mrs. McCord and James McCord and all the others get the message. James Morton, he had information of Gerald Ford and laundered money, and it may have hindered the appointment of Gerald Ford as the next president of the United States. He's dead. Dr. Gary Morris, his name was with Mrs. Dorothy Hunt when she killed. He and his wife are dead. We'll go into Richard Lavoie, who was a babysitter for the ITT, took care of Dita Baird. He died last December. Murray Chotiner, his name is mentioned, regards the Milk Fund, spies of the Democratic headquarters, possibility that Alfred Baldwin turned over the tapes to him. He died. Ralph Blodgett, involved with John Mitchell, the Justice Department, and antitrust payoffs in regards to the El Paso gas. James Kruger, White House intelligence plans, he had information. Kruger and Blodgett were both working attorneys for the gas company in Indiana that had information of John Mitchell and El Paso gas. And J. Edgar Hoover, victim of the White House intelligence plans, who had to be murdered in order for those operations to go into effect. J. Clifford Dietrich of the Secret Service, killed in a helicopter outside of the compound where Richard Nixon was in the Bahamas. Mr. Taub, involved with Herbert Kalmbach, secret $2 million hush money, killed on the border of Switzerland after he was beat up. Joseph Toriano and Arthur Rodriguez. Down in the Miami community, Cubans who would have important links between Mr. Sturgis, Bernard Barker, Richard Nixon, Bebe Rebozo, through the Miami Cuban connections, and Mrs. Andrew Topping, who had to be silenced because her husband had plans and appointment to get to the White House and kill Richard Nixon, and those were halted because of the Watergate exposures, and Mr. Topping did say that she was killed by a member of their team because she knew too much. The story will go back. These are the people that have information on the milk funds, Dita Beard, the ITT, the Justice Department, the gas deal with the Soviet Union, White House intelligence plans. You see how much these people knew. Set up the enemy list, the Wallace shooting, the relationship of McCord to an attorney in Washington, D.C. All these people were pivotal people that knew too much. Now, there was an article, the one I'm reading is by Doug Porter, on Beverly Kay, and as I say, we mentioned her in March. He used the expression termination with extreme prejudice. He had information from the federal offices that the order went out. That's used by the intelligence agencies. Tackwood uses it, refers to it in the Glass House tape. Termination with extreme prejudice means kill her, she knows too much, or kill him. It's a standard tool used by our intelligence agencies all over the world for people who are 1, troublemakers, 2, security risks, or 3, in opposition to political parties. We've used it in Greece, Chile, South Vietnam. The Central Intelligence Agency, the Phoenix program, used it on 40,000 civilians in Vietnam who died without trial. The Phoenix assassination team, the name down there now is called F6 and not the Phoenix. They changed it to the F6. The same techniques of Vietnam War are being used in the United States. Beverly Kay, in December 73, was in the White House. She was a secretary working for Stephen Bull of the Secret Service, and her job was to keep the tape recordings of Richard Nixon. She stored and preserved these tapes in her desk. That was her task, and she would be a very important witness if ever the Senate Watergate Committee wanted to know about any erasures or 2 tapes that we heard were not recorded at all, that didn't exist. Those could have existed, and she could have known it, and then they were destroyed later. She would have known a lot about the White House tapes because the conversation with John Mitchell and John Dean, the 2 most important tapes, we were told didn't exist. When for a long time they were fighting not to reveal them. When they said we'll turn them over, then they said they never existed. Beverly's ex-husband is in the Air Force Intelligence. She lived in Virginia. She was at the White House and felt ill. The White House doctor was summoned. They took her downstairs. She collapsed and died of a massive stroke. The coroner at Allegheny County said that the death by stroke is a statistical aberration. She was in her early 40s, had never been sick before, but could have been caused by the injection of an air bubble in the bloodstream. Her funeral was paid for by the White House. Her friends and family could not see the open coffin. Stephen Bull, the Secret Service agent, refused to allow the casket to be opened. Notice was made in the article that this is not normal for a young person with no previous illness to not have the casket open, because with a stroke today and with the wonders of science, the body looks like it's sleeping, and there was no reason for the secrecy of Beverly Kay. The other man I mentioned was George Bell. The question came up June 30th. He died in 1973. The question came up at the Watergate hearings about who made up the enemy list. Was it used for Internal Revenue Services? Who selected the enemies? And Charles Colson, who is great at denial, denied every charge about him until the day copped a guilty on a minor charge, denied any involvement in the enemy list. It was described by John Dean in his testimony. George Bell, the late George Bell, was the one who kept the list, and there was an article June the 30th, 1973, that he expired. There was a longtime security cop who was employed by James McCord, worked for him for many years. He was going to work at the Republican convention. He brought a dozen checks in different amounts from James McCord to Bernard Fensterwald's committee. Bernard Fensterwald has been working on the investigation of James Earl Ray, John Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, particularly, not so much the Robert Kennedy, but he's been trying to open up the James Ray case, and he's been an attorney for James Ray on and off, and he headed in Washington the committee to investigate assassinations. A lot of people around the country are dropping away from the committee. They believe it's too infiltrated by the CIA, and a lot of the researchers question James McCord, Bernard Fensterwald, after McCord went to him for his attorney. I'm not taking sides on the issue, but when the question came up about did McCord know Bernard Fensterwald long in advance of when he was supposed to know him, the man who was bringing the checks, allegedly bringing checks back and forth from James McCord to Bernard Fensterwald, Lou Russell, and there was an article July 31st, 1973, that he's dead. This article was in the Boston Phoenix, dated May the 12th, 1973, if you want to look it up, about the relationship of Russell, McCord, and Fensterwald. Congressman William Mills in Maryland was the recipient of $25,000 of secret money. It went through a whole series of washings. It involved cold cash. It was arranged for by John Mitchell. No one explained where the cash went or what it was used for or how it was forwarded or where it wound up, but it was transferred to him in April 71, and in 72 George Wallace was shot in Maryland, his home state. When Congressman William Mills found out about the people investigating that $25,000, he claimed he didn't know about it. He had never reported it, but he was found dead the next day outside his barn, allegedly suicide. Part of the money, the $25,000, came from $1.7 million that Hugh Sloan Jr. had, that was supposedly was raised early, long before the 72 date, because this involved a 71 cash. Robert Hitt, the executive assistant to Robert Morgan, received the money from the Interior Department and Rogers Morton went to the Interior Department, then went to a Mary Beale, the Interior Secretary, and then was delivered to a Mr. Allison and a Trelevin and Reitz. Ken Reitz' name runs through this secret money all the time. He works right now at Warner Brothers in charge of the recording studio. The money went down a chain of command went to a Colonel Webster who handled the money for Congressman Mills, but then he was killed in an automobile accident. And so the two men that handled the money were both killed. Colonel James Webster was killed, and James Glover in February 1972. This was just, the Wallace shooting was in May 72. They handled the financial accounts of Congressman William Mills. It was an unusual contribution, and the only one that would know where the money was going, what it would be used for, was retired Air Force Colonel Webster, who handled the money and dispersed it, and he's the only one. And his only aide that would also work the money with him was Robert Morton, a Nixon man. Both men were killed in an automobile crash in February 1972. Nikos Fardionis, I don't know if I pronounce it right, was investigated starting in 1972 for foreign gifts, money that was given out of foreign countries. The Arab nations had given donations to the Nixon campaign, which are illegal and are not being investigated properly. I haven't seen anything in the news about that, even though they made their fair share of profit off of that quick energy crisis that we had for a few months. Very quietly, I haven't heard much about the investigation of Tom Pappas, but this particular ship owner, Nikos, gave $27,000 gift. The Justice Department was investigating, but as soon as he died of a heart attack, the Justice Department decided that they wouldn't investigate the campaign practices, that it wasn't illegal, and as long as he was dead, they wouldn't investigate the money of the Greek money coming into the elections in the United States. Jack Cleveland is a man, the Watergate committee was looking into the accounts of Richard Nixon's brother Don, and Jack Cleveland owned property with Donald Nixon. He had a secret bank account with Robert Vesco, Jack Cleveland did. Donald Nixon denied that Howard Hughes was instrumental in getting him any interest in a ranch out of Nevada, in Nye County, Nevada. This ranch used to be owned by Jack Cleveland, who also worked for Howard Hughes. And there was a story that Donald Nixon was part owner in this ranch. Cleveland was looked for investigation and questioning on whether or not Howard Hughes did provide this ranch for Donald Nixon, but Cleveland died November 1973, so he couldn't be called for questioning. The friends of Cleveland said that Howard Hughes had instructed Cleveland to turn over the ranch to Donald Nixon as partly as possible payment for Donald's efforts to win Air West for Howard Hughes. And his friends, Jack Cleveland's friends, confirmed that Donald was a partner of deceased Cleveland, but Donald denies it, and Jack Cleveland is dead, so that matter will never be investigated. He died November 1973. Mrs. Dorothy Hunt, most of you know that name. We've gone into that many times on the show. Washington refuses to investigate the plane crash in which 45 other people were on her. She was embarrassing the White House. Her murder could be an example for Mrs. James McCord, who had been busy burning typewriter ribbons for her husband, because most of the top CIA wives, men and wives, are both CIA. They're married to CIA agents. But the death of Mrs. Dorothy Hunt was enough to frighten all of the people, and particularly James McCord, to knowing that he would be killed. And the important thing about the plane crash and the conspiracy that's been covered up was that three men in the White House heavily involved in pivotal positions to hurt Richard Nixon, and espionage and dirty tricks, which they were needed in the White House because they were going into the investigations and they'd have to cover their tracks. But as soon as that plane went down in Chicago with Mrs. Hunt on it, Mrs. Dorothy Hunt on it in December 1972, then Alex Butterfield of the White House, who still had his military assignment, was ordered directly to Civil Aeronautics to become head of the Federal Aviation. And he took on a new job. In fact, he took it on so fast he hadn't resigned from the military CIA job, so he had to get his resignation cleared and go on to the Federal Aviation. Egil Crow went directly from the Domestic Council and the White House, the Plumbers Unit, directly to the Department of Transportation to head that. And Dwight Chapin went directly to the United Airlines in Chicago, where the investigation would be taking place on that airplane. It would be interesting to know when these three men applied for their jobs, if they even considered them, before December 72. Had they sent in applications, they scattered these three men into the most pivotal positions to not only cover the airplane crash of Dorothy Hunt, but any other agent that they want to crash in an airline could be very easily covered now, because these men are placed Department of Transportation and Civil Aeronautics. Now, James Morton was an important witness, because if Gerald Ford from the Warren Commission was selected a long time ago to be the President of the United States, and this has come out in evidence Richard Nixon had considered selecting him as the Vice President, he has been considered a presidential candidate waiting behind the lines by a strong military clique in the Pentagon, and nothing could interfere with his appointment at this particular time to get next in the chain of command. James Morton had information about laundered money that Gerald Ford was receiving or allegedly receiving. Of course, Gerald Ford denied the charges. They said he didn't report these contributions. There were things of his campaign, $13,000 in Michigan. Ford said he didn't know the names of the donors because the committee treasurer took care of he was the political official for the chemical industry, took care of these matters. But James Morton, the man who handled the money that was washed through many hands before it got into the committee that Gerald Ford would be the recipient of, James Morton was dead at the time of the appointment of Gerald Ford as vice president and couldn't be called as a witness. Now, Dorothy Hunt was killed in that airplane in December 72, and in her wallet was the name of a Washington psychiatrist, Dr. Gary Morris, and Mrs. Morris. And this is interesting because Dorothy Hunt was killed in December 1972. But Dr. and Mrs. Morris died in March 1972, which preceded by many months the death of Mrs. Hunt. And she had the name, he was a psychiatrist, and she had the name of Dr. and Mrs. Morris in her purse when she died. And you would wonder, what in the world is the woman carrying around the name of somebody who's been dead so many months? When she's on a trip, she would take necessary papers she needs, but what would she take this for? And she allegedly was going to Chicago, then down to Costa Rica or the Bahamas, one of the islands down the Caribbean. Well, Dr. Morris and his wife vanished under mysterious circumstances. They were vacationing on Santa Lucia, and they disappeared in a boating accident, and no trace of them has ever been found. And they died months before the Watergate, 3 months before the Watergate arrests in June. And nobody associated them with the Hunts. But when I think of the death of Dr. and Mrs. Morris, I remember that Frank Sturgis, and we talked about this on another show, 3 days before the arrest at the Watergate, opened up a non-profit church in Miami, Florida, that the Internal Revenue gave him a tax deduction on. He was to become a pastor of some kind. This was one of the CIA dummy fronts, and the board of directors of the church was not only Frank Sturgis, but his wife, Mrs. Sturgis, and then a Mrs. Doris Hunt. Now, the Mrs. Doris Hunt, that name that they had, was a woman who died a few years earlier of leukemia, I believe. So that this deceased woman was on the board of directors of an Internal Revenue, a tax-free church that was opened up prior, just in June of 1972. And Mrs. Dorothy Hunt could use the name of Doris Hunt because the money for the Cubans and for hiring provocateurs was going to come through that group down in Frank Sturgis that had arrangements to hire violence for the Republican convention. So Dorothy Hunt was working with the Cuban money, and it comes out in the Watergate hearings, and taking money down to them. And she could use the name of the deceased Doris Hunt because she was Dorothy Hunt. So I wonder if she was traveling with the name of Mr. and Mrs. Dr. and Mrs. Gary Morris because she was going down to an island down there, and she could use the deceased name and take on their identity like she could Doris Hunt. That's the only reason that she would be using the deceased identity of one party in Miami, and then in December 72 carrying around the name of a doctor and his wife who had been dead for many months, died 3 months before the Watergate entry, and from March to December is like 8 months, and she's traveling to Chicago, then the Caribbean, with the name of a dead couple. So the mystery of Dr. and Mrs. Gary Morris is linked to Howard Hunt and the espionage group in some way. There's another murder of Richard Lavoie. He was Lavoie, chief of security for the ITT. Now, he guarded Dita Beard, and he became part of her family. He kept track of her in the hospital in Denver, whoever goes in or out, or maybe the bugging device in the room. You know, the White House sent carnations that have bugging devices in them. This came out last fall in the exposures. Well, he died in December 1972 of a heart attack, and he was replaced by a new man, Mr. Lazzarini, who quit ITT just recently and exposed it and said he as much as said he was running for his life. He realized he was doing security for the ITT in exchange for the job that Richard Lavoie said. But when he quit there, and his job also was to guard Dita Beard, he said in quotes, "I've seen enough and heard enough to conclude that the ITT can do anything it wants to. It is a government all to itself." And as regarding Dita Beard and being with her, he said, while he was with her and with the IT, he says they know everything before it happens. They know about the grand juries. They know what they talk about. They know what the FBI was doing. So he realized after one chief of security was dead, and he was there a short while, he walked out and said he was resigning from that job. Murray Chotiner. We're running out of time in the details of these deaths. We have about 1 minute to go. Murray Chotiner was hit by a truck Sunday afternoon, just a little while ago. He was important because it was suggested that he received the logs from Alfred Baldwin across the street from the Watergate Hotel. He was also the decisive witness in the case of Maurice Stans and John Mitchell, that Robert Vesco said if Chotiner were alive, he would have changed the course of that trial. Chotiner was important for placing spies in the Democratic camp that was called Chapman's Friends. Remember, he had Seymour Frieden and another woman journalist spying, and he also was brought up in the Melk case. He was the important link of Chotiner with the Melk contributions to Richard Nixon, and he left the White House 3 weeks after the Melk deal and became a special lawyer for the Milk Association, the largest dairy cooperative, and was put on a fee of $57,000 for the Milk Fund. And Chotiner was an important name, and he died. It was January 30th, 1974. Well, they call the SLA violent. They call them obsessed with death, suicidal, crazed fanatics. Look around and see who is really the crazed fanatics in our society. As you read these psychological resumes of the SLA, remember what Washington D.C. is doing. Their officials, the Justice Department, the Intelligence Agency, they're lopping off their witnesses. I have some more to read here. There isn't time. We'll see you next week. Keep reading. Save your articles. And we'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy.
Mom, Dad, I'm okay.
She was born with a silver spoon, money and means.
I had a few scrapes and stuff, but they've washed them up and they're getting okay, and I've caught a cold, but they're giving me pills for it, and so I'm kept blindfolded, usually so that I can't identify anyone. My hands are often tied, but
Her daddy is a rich
they're
man,
not.
$1 million dealer.
I just want you to know that I'm going to do everything I can to get you out of there.
But that ain't enough.
It's a little frightening because the original demand is what I was afraid of from the beginning, is that one that's impossible to meet.
Oh, but I got plans.
In the next 24 or 48 hours, I'll be trying to do my best to come back with some kind of a counteroffer that's acceptable.
And just do it as fast as you can,
Yeah.
and everything will be fine.
I know you could have done it the way the SLA asked. And I know that we have enough money. I don't believe that you are doing everything you can, everything in your power. I don't believe that you're doing anything at all. If it had been you, Mom.
We love you, Patty, and we're all praying for you.
The demand of the SLA is far beyond my financial capability. Take care of yourself. Far beyond my financial capability. And you take care of yourself. Far beyond my financial capability. Take care of yourself. The matter is now out of my hand. And you take care of yourself. The demand of the SLA. And you take care of yourself. The matter is now out of my hand. Financial capability. Out of my hand. Far beyond my financial capability. Out of my hand. 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 Out of my hand.
We love you, Patty.
I no longer fear the SLA because they are not the ones who want me to die.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussel, who for over 10 years has been researching the facts behind the political assassinations in this country so that the truth may be revealed. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB-FM in Carmel, California.